Our second reading this morning is taken from The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and is called Letter to My Nephew. This innocent country set you down in a ghetto in which, in fact, it intended that you should perish. Let me spell out precisely what I mean by that. For the heart of the matter is here, and the root of my dispute with my country. You were born where you were born and faced the future that you faced because you were Black and for no other reason. The limits of your ambition were thus expected to be set forever. You were born into a society which spelled out with brutal clarity and in as many ways possible that you were a worthless human being. You were not expected to aspire to excellence. You were expected to make peace with mediocrity. Wherever you have turned in your short time on this earth, you have been told where you could go and what you could do and how you could do it, and where you could live and whom you should marry. The details and symbols of your life have been deliberately constructed to make you believe what white people say about you. Please try to remember that what they believe, as well as what they do and cause you to endure, does not testify to your inferiority, but to their inhumanity and fear. I want to thank Reverend Tim for giving me the opportunity to share in the service this morning. I want to first share an anecdote about an eye-opening experience that I had around privilege. Every summer, we spend a week or so at the Outer Banks with the families of my two medical school roommates, who are brothers and are white, as are their families. A few years ago, one of their family members mentioned that he had been stopped for speeding on the way down to the beach, but had been let off with a warning. I remarked that I had been stopped 6 times for driving infractions and had been given a ticket every time. And I asked all the adults there, 10 or 11 of them, if they had ever been let off with a warning over a driving incident. Every one of them had. That in itself was somewhat disturbing, but what really struck me was that none of them had questioned whether everybody got the same treatment. They were stunned that I had always gotten a ticket, and that's privilege. It's not just that you get things other people don't get because of who you are, because of the luck of the lottery. It's also that it never occurs to you that others aren't getting what you got. David Foster Wallace, the author of the novel Infinite Jest, related this metaphor about privilege at a commencement speech. An old fish is swimming in the ocean along, and 2 younger fish approaching. As they near each other, the older fish says, "How's the water, boys?" and swims on. The younger fish swim on for a few seconds, and then one of them stops and turns to the other and says, "What's water?" Privilege is the ocean that buoys us, some of us, up, allows us to glide gracefully through life without our knowledge of its existence. I turn now to another water analogy, that of a fast-flowing river. Racism is that river, and we are all being carried by it. It surrounds us, penetrates us, pervades everything that we do. It's sort of like the Force from Star Wars, carrying us along as it rushes toward the ocean of privilege. Some have no trouble navigating the river. Some are dashed on the rocks or drowned. Racists spend their time channeling water from streams into the river to increase its flow. To be non-racist, like the many of us who believe sincerely that we are not racist and say sincerely and with truth, "I'm not racist," is to simply float along with the current, secure in the knowledge that we aren't doing anything to make the river swell its banks, and trusting that eventually the source will dry up. To be anti-racist is to spend one's time swimming upstream, trying to dam the river or to divert its flow so that its effects are no longer felt. I have become convinced over the last year or two that in my practice of medicine, I need to be anti-racist if I want to make an impact on the innumerable health disparities that are related to race. And the hard part for many people to accept about being anti-racist is summed up by this quote from the historian Ibram X. Kendi. "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. I will tell you right now that race-neutral policies in healthcare, medical education, medical research are failing in their goal to level the playing field, because everything that we do is touched by centuries of racism that is embedded in all of our laws, policies, systems, behaviors, and institutions. If I really want to remedy racially related discrimination in healthcare, then I am obligated to act in a way that explicitly buoys up those who have been discriminated against and have missed out on wearing the invisible backpack of privilege. I'll leave you with one last quote that I was introduced to recently and really resonates with me, from Aboriginal Australian activist by way of Lilla Watson. If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Interestingly, as I was preparing today's YOUU session, I came across this quote from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone, because none of us are free unless all of us are free. None of us are safe unless all of us are safe. None of us are healthy unless all of us are healthy. And none of us can truly fulfill our dreams unless all of us can. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg, for sharing your experience and your wisdom, your passion, and your commitment to anti-racism with all of us. I only reached out to Greg like 4 or 5 days ago to say, I know you retired as a worship weaver. Any chance we could get you out of retirement to participate in this service? I promised, as I just told Greg a few minutes ago, that I'll put a few extra dollars into Worship Weaver Pension Fund to compensate him for this. I think Greg knows that that's a fund that has not been created. Spent already. And I also want to say that when Greg said yes and decided to share a reflection, he mentioned to me that he hadn't reflected before from this pulpit. And let me just say that as far as I'm concerned, this may have been your first time, but it will not be your last. By the way, can everybody hear me okay? Anybody having any trouble? Christine's giving a little shakiness in the back. I don't know. A little hard in the back. Okay. Well, I'll try to speak up a little bit without shouting. So let me just begin by saying that I'm hearing a little background. Should I just stop using this and use the pulpit? Would that be better, Rachel? Okay. How's that? Okay. Let me make sure I turn this off. There we go. Okay, now here I am. So let me just begin by saying that for all of my life, I have been floating, swimming along in that ocean of privilege and racism that Greg just talked about. An ocean that has enabled me to be the beneficiary of an enormous array of privileges that come from being white, male, and straight. Privileges that are given to me because of the color of my skin, because of my gender, because of my sexual orientation. I have never known what it's like to be the object of suspicion simply because of the way I look. I don't believe I know I haven't been harassed, and I don't think I've ever been followed in a retail store because It's assumed I'm a shoplifter. As a teenager, I was never followed by a armed crime watch volunteer simply because I was passing through his neighborhood. And I've never been profiled by law enforcement. In fact, during my few encounters with the police, I have always been treated with the utmost courtesy and respect. And like Greg's friends, I've almost always received a warning rather than being ticketed. My privilege has also opened countless doors that might have otherwise been closed. Wealth that was handed down from previous generations in my family enabled me to attend college and graduate school without incurring massive debt. And that same wealth has enabled me to live in mostly affluent communities and neighborhoods. When Carol and I have rented or purchased homes, we've never been steered away from certain towns or neighborhoods, and we've certainly never been subjected to predatory lending practices. Access to high-quality healthcare has been easy and available and has enabled my family to stay relatively healthy and to receive state-of-the-art treatment when needed. And although Carol and I worried about our children's safety, as all parents do, I've never had to have the talk about encounters with law enforcement that so many African American parents feel compelled to have with their children. And the reason my family and I have found so many doors and opportunities open to us isn't because we're good or virtuous or because we have worked harder or are more deserving. I haven't been treated with respect while driving or shopping because I'm a good guy or a nice guy. I've been treated that way because I'm a white guy. My family and I have been afforded so many opportunities and so much privilege simply because in this country, in this society, our lives matter. I wish I could tell you that I have used my privilege to create change or to build a more just and anti-racist world, but I can't and I haven't. Rather, my response has been, as Greg just said so well, much more close to a non-racist who lives in a bubble of comfort and complacency while remaining ignorant or indifferent to the ocean of racism and white supremacy that all of us swim in. And it's not that I've been unaware of all the injustice and equality that comes along with white supremacy. I've known, and I certainly read the media and read articles about disparities and such, and I know I've been aware for many, many decades that in virtually every statistical indicator of opportunity and well-being, employment, wealth, poverty, homelessness, access to healthcare, quality education, and so on, Black and brown citizens have far fewer opportunities and resources than white Americans. African Americans are far more likely to be the victims of crime, far more likely to experience harassment and violence from law enforcement, far more likely to be prosecuted and incarcerated for nonviolent crimes, which, had I committed them, would almost never lead to incarceration. But wait a minute. This is my white protectiveness coming up. Aren't things a whole lot better than they used to be? I mean, isn't the kind of racism and inhumanity that made slavery and segregation both possible and morally acceptable a thing of the past? I mean, the words we heard from Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin were written in the 1960s. That was that world. This is a much better and more just world. That response and that argument have been, for most of my life, my argument and my rationalization. But slowly, too slowly, I have begun to wake up to the world as it is, not as I'd like to believe it is, to make me feel comfortable. A two-tiered world of privilege for me and injustice and inequality for so many others. I'd like to take you back now to an event, a moment that I think in many ways began to pierce my bubble of comfort and privilege. A moment that exposed a reality that so many live with, while people like me continue to hide behind the fantasy that things are getting better, they're improving. I imagine many of you remember Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast in 2005. I didn't live in New Orleans or on the Gulf Coast at that time, but the images of the physical destruction from the hurricane were like nothing I'd ever seen, including, and I grew up in Florida. But as devastating as those images were, in many ways, the pictures of what came after were even more shocking. And it is those images, those realities that finally began to wake me up from my complacency and my assumption that for the most part, I can sit back and do little about racism and white supremacy because, again, it's not as bad as it was. Things are moving in the right direction. Among the thousands who were left homeless and stranded in the city of New Orleans, most came from predominantly African-American neighborhoods like the lower Ninth Ward. Although evacuation orders had been issued, many couldn't leave because they didn't have cars or other means of escape. Survivors made their way to places like the Louisiana Superdome and the New Orleans Convention Center because they'd been told help would be available. But when they got to those places, there was little or no help to be found. No food, no water, no medical care or medication for those with chronic illnesses, nothing. People soon began dying of thirst, malnutrition, and disease. Now, this terrible situation might have been, I guess, a little understandable had the resources needed to help the victims of the storm been unavailable. But those resources were available. They sat on trucks right outside the city. But for days, those supplies just sat on those trucks and people continued to die and suffer. And the reason desperately needed supplies failed to arrive is that rather than helping the victims, federal, state, and local authorities chose instead to point guns at them. And there can be no other reason for that in the midst of one of the worst disasters in its history, a nation would choose to treat its own citizens, its own people, like criminals to be controlled and subjugated, rather than as fellow citizens. There can be no other reason than the simple fact that the vast majority of the victims were African American and poor. I would like to share with you a few images from Katrina. They're not easy to look at, so I want to just give you that warning ahead of time. But I want you to just take a look. I've just got 3 or 4. And I want you to see that rather than providing bottled water, food, and medical care from the outset, these first responders, which you will see in just a moment, rode around on armored personnel carriers, pointing guns at those who were suffering. Here's another image of what I assume is a father holding a child who is unconscious and perhaps seriously ill. And look at the way those soldiers are responding. He's receiving a distant stare as these soldiers have their fingers on the triggers of their rifles. What does it say? What does it say about our nation, about our values, about the system that we celebrate as being just and democratic? What does it say when our fellow citizens, our fellow Americans are treated like this? Now, I want to make sure to point out that it wasn't just the police or the military who were stoking racism and behaving in inhumane ways. The media dutifully played its part in stoking those fires, and here is a particularly egregious example. Take a look at these photos. I know it's hard to read the captions, but basically what you see there on either side are two pictures of the same thing. Victims of the storm carrying items that they took from a grocery store. What is revealing is that while the caption of the image of the young African, I assume is the African-American man there, notice that highlighted is the word looting. The two white individuals on the left are congratulated for finding supplies. It's the same picture on either side of the screen. Now, of course, it shouldn't have taken these images and the image you saw earlier to wake me up to the fact that racism and white supremacy remain prevalent. Long before Katrina destroyed the Gulf Coast, I kept my eyes largely closed to the horrible implications and outcomes of the so-called war on drugs that was used to incarcerate a whole generation of African American men. I sloughed off the insidious ways politicians and the news media and talk radio castigated poverty-stricken Black and brown Americans, using terms like welfare queens and cheats in order to stoke white resentment and justify massive cuts in public assistance. The evidence was all there, all around, but it took those images to finally wake me up. And that's the racism that we see today. It's a racism, yes, of people who are bigoted and prejudiced, but it's also a racism that's institutionalized, that's woven into the structure of our society. The problem during Katrina wasn't just a few bad apples among law enforcement or the military. In fact, they were doing what law enforcement and National Guard's troops have been doing in this country for decades, protecting the privilege while controlling and subjugating people of color. And as much as I'd like to believe that things are getting better, think about the images and the videos because of the prevalence of these that we are now seeing all too often. Images of brutal acts of violence and murder against African Americans by law enforcement and by others, but certainly by law enforcement. I think back to Michael Brown and Tamir Rice, Eric Garner and Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, Philando Castile and George Floyd. The names go on and on and on. All precious lives taken by those who were supposed to protect those lives. So I want to conclude by saying a word about what it means to embrace and embody the anti-racism that Greg quoted Dr. Ibram X. Kendi about. What does that mean for a person of privilege like myself, for Unitarian Universalism, and for this congregation, the UU congregation of Charlottesville? Well, on a personal level, even though I'm starting to wake up, when I consider all that I have gained from a system that honors my life while harming and diminishing the lives of so many of my fellow citizens, I still can feel uncomfortable, maybe even guilty. Sometimes that discomfort and guilt can lead me to act and speak a little defensively and to practice avoidance when questions of race and privilege come up. There's a term for this defensiveness and avoidance. You may have heard it or read about it, white fragility. I've got it. I've got it. But you know, the longer I feel that discomfort and experience my own white fragility, the more I try to see it as trying to teach me something important about myself and the world. You know, there's a famous quote from the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I quote in many of my sermons, who was a close friend and colleague of Dr. King's, that keeps coming back to me in moments like this. Heschel said, "In a free society, some are guilty, but all are responsible." And that's the lesson that I'm taking from my own privilege. Not to stop at guilt, which often leads to avoidance and defensiveness, but instead make the journey to a sense of responsibility. Responsibility for dismantling a system that has benefited me while harming so many. And that's what I mean by the title of today's service, The Responsibility of Privilege. Rather than stopping at guilt or shame or hiding or avoiding all the pain and misery and suffering of this world, I have a responsibility to use my privilege and the power and influence that come with it to dismantle these structures that hold so many back and hold so many down. And I believe that responsibility to build a world of justice and equality for all, that must be at the center of Unitarian Universalism. We are a religion that affirms the dignity and worth of all people, not just white people. And at times in our history, we have boldly and courageously allied ourselves with movements challenging a racist status quo. Think about the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement. But those times when we have been allies for justice have too often been followed by inaction, complacency, and even sometimes backlash within our denomination and our congregations. Rather than building on the history that we are justifiably proud of, Unitarian Universalists have sometimes found it easier to return to the comfort of our predominantly white congregations and to avoid the difficult and sometimes uncomfortable work of confronting racism and white supremacy in our nation, in our communities, and yes, in Unitarian Universalism. Now, speaking of doing difficult work, I want to again congratulate all of you for the decision you made to change your name. I know that decision wasn't easy, and it had been in the system, in the ocean of UUCville for a number of years, but you did it. And by changing your name, I think you have opened the doors of this congregation wider and put us on the side of love and welcome for all. I am so looking forward to seeing our new sign up on Rugby Road, and I do hope that many of you contributed to that collection today, and if you haven't, to please do so at a later time. And I want to end on a hopeful and positive note. I want you all to know that I am filled with hope about our future. We have so much potential to be a bold and courageous ally in the struggle for racial justice here in Charlottesville, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and in the wider world. Now, this work won't be easy, but it's work that we have to do. We have much to learn and will undoubtedly make mistakes along the way. But we should never let our imperfections stop us from taking responsibility for the brokenness in our world and doing something about it. As you heard earlier, we're going to have this space for a conversation in a few minutes, and I do hope that you will come back, stay, or come back and join us. It'll be an opportunity for you to share your thoughts, your ideas, your stories. Reflect on where you think this calling, this sense of responsibility may be leading us. Friends, just remember, there is so much that we can do, so much that we can give, so much that we can change. So let's get started. Let's build a new way together. Amen. Blessed be, and thank you so much for listening this morning.